The night had been quiet. Too quiet. Serena Jackson's eyes swept over the dark landscape as she steered her car off the highway. The lights of the gas station flickered in the distance, casting a soft glow across the otherwise empty stretch of road. It was the kind of place where nothing ever happened. Just a stop for weary travelers in the middle of nowhere. But Serena wasn't here by accident. A part of her had always been aware that danger lurked in the most ordinary places. And after weeks of intense operations, tonight was supposed to be a rare moment of peace. A chance to catch her breath, refuel, and perhaps get a few hours of rest. But as she pulled into the lot, something about the scene made her pause. She parked her car near the pumps, the engine humming softly before it fell silent. The station was nearly deserted, except for a lone cashier behind the counter, his face glowing from the bluish light of his phone screen. A couple of cars were parked here, but the people inside seemed uninterested in anything beyond the comfort of their own little worlds. Still, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the only one awake tonight. The brief stillness of the night felt like a warning. Serena didn't trust it. She excited her vehicle, her movements smooth and purposeful. The soft crunch of her boots against the gravel barely made a sound. But she felt the weight of every step. Her senses heightened, alert, as if she were already preparing for something unexpected. She glanced around, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, the placement of the security cameras, the flickering fluorescent light above the cashier's counter, the faint smell of cleaning supplies that still lingered in the air. Everything seemed ordinary, too ordinary. But then, she noticed him. Across the lot, barely visible in the dim light, sat a patrol car. The officer behind the wheel was alone, tapping his fingers nervously on the steering wheel. From the moment she had pulled in, his eyes hadn't left her. There was something about him, something that didn't sit right with her. He was watching her too closely, too intensely. Serena had learned long ago to trust her instincts, and everything in her told her that this wasn't a simple pit stop. There was a reason she was being watched, and she was determined to find out why. As she filled her car with gas, she kept her attention on the officer, who had yet to make a move. His gaze never faltered, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Serena finished pumping gas and made her way toward the convenience store. The sound of her footsteps drowned by the silence of the night. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the store's interior. The cashier didn't even look up as she grabbed a bottle of water and a snack. Serena's mind was already calculating her next steps. The world outside was quiet, but her training had taught her that peace was often the calm before the storm. That's when she heard the chime of the door. Serena didn't need to look up. She knew exactly who it was. He stepped in with the same air of authority he had behind the wheel of his patrol car. Officer Riley. He wasn't here for a routine stop. His posture, the way he moved, was the kind of aggression Serena had seen too many times before. His presence exuded control, but it was the kind of control that came from fear. His gaze was locked on her with such intensity that it sent a shiver down her spine. But she didn't flinch. She wasn't here to back down. She finished paying for her items and turned to leave. But as expected, Riley stepped into her path. "Evening," he said, his voice rough, commanding. Serena met his gaze, her expression unchanged. "Evening, officer," she replied, her tone steady. She knew exactly where this was headed. His eyes narrowed. "What brings you out here tonight?" Serena raised an eyebrow slightly, the smallest trace of a smile tugging at her lips. "Just passing through," she said simply, her voice as calm as ever. But Riley didn't like that answer. He was already stepping closer, invading her personal space. "This isn't the kind of place people just pass through," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. Serena's heart didn't race. It never did. Instead, her mind began calculating the possibilities. Riley wasn't here to ask questions. He was here to intimidate. With a slow breath, she glanced down at the water bottle in her hand and then back up at him. "Getting gas," she said, lifting the bag slightly to show him the snack she had just purchased. "And now, I'm heading out." Riley's hand hovered near his belt, close to his holster, but he made no move to draw his weapon. He was trying to assert dominance. He wanted her to flinch, to show fear, but she didn't. The silence between them stretched on, thick with unspoken challenges. Serena didn't back down. She didn't even blink. Riley hesitated, the control he thought he had over the situation starting to slip away. His frustration was palpable, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, Serena could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Then, he stepped aside, but not before throwing a final, lingering look at her as she walked toward her car. Serena slid into the driver's seat, placing the bag on the passenger side. She didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, she glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as Riley returned to his patrol car, his eyes still locked on her. She wasn't fooled. This wasn't over. Serena knew exactly how these kinds of situations went. Riley wouldn't let this go. Not with his bruised ego. She pulled out of the gas station and onto the highway, her senses still on high alert. The distant glow of Riley's headlights flickered behind her, and though he kept his distance, she could tell he was following her. It was a game now. A dangerous one, but a game nonetheless, and Serena knew how to play. The road stretched out before Serena, a ribbon of darkness swallowed by the night. She kept her speed steady, neither too fast nor too slow, giving Officer Riley no legitimate reason to pull her over. Her fingers rested lightly on the steering wheel, her breathing even, yet every part of her was alert. In her rearview mirror, Riley's headlights glowed faintly, just enough to remind her that she wasn't free of him yet. Her instinct screamed at her to keep moving, to not give him any reason to escalate this. But she knew that wasn't going to stop him. It never did. Riley wasn't like most officers. There was a certain desperation in his pursuit. It wasn't about maintaining the law. No, this was about control. And for someone like him, that control was slipping away with every moment that passed without her showing even a hint of fear. For the next few miles, the two of them traveled in silence, the tension palpable in the air. Riley kept his distance, but she could sense the shift in his behavior. He wasn't just tailing her anymore. He was obsessed. Each time she glanced in the rearview mirror, his headlights seemed a little closer, a little more eager. The stretch of road ahead of her seemed to stretch on endlessly. And the quiet hum of her car's engine was the only sound breaking the stillness. Serena's mind raced, her years of training now fully engaged. She analyzed every possible move Riley might make, calculating the risks of each choice. The quiet night felt heavy with expectation, as though the world itself was waiting for something to break the calm. She could feel Riley's presence even without looking. It was in the way his headlights danced in the reflection of the rearview mirror, in the small shifts of the steering wheel as he mimicked her movements, staying just close enough to keep the pressure on. But the smart move wasn't to drive any faster. It was to stay steady and see how far he was willing to go. Minutes passed, and the stillness of the road became almost suffocating. Riley was still behind her, but something had shifted. His lights weren't flickering in her mirror anymore, they were steadily burning brighter. As if he had made a decision. Serena didn't need to look to know. She knew he was about to make a move. Then, The sound of sirens cut through the air. Serena's pulse didn't skip a beat. She had been expecting this. Riley had finally found his excuse. The sharp, insistent sound of the siren grew louder as he closed the gap. Serena's eyes narrowed, and she exhaled slowly. She wasn't going to make it easy for him. She wasn't going to make the mistake of showing him fear. Her fingers brushed against the dashboard as she pulled over to the side of the road. The tires crunching against the gravel. She didn't even have to glance at Riley's vehicle to know exactly where he was. His car slid to a halt behind her, the flashing red and blue lights slicing through the darkness like a blade. Serena kept her hands on the steering wheel, her posture calm and controlled. She was already thinking several steps ahead. Her mind was calculating the next move, preparing for whatever Riley might throw her way. It didn't matter that this was just another traffic stop. It wasn't about the law. This was about his ego, his sense of control. The sound of boots hitting the gravel signaled that he was approaching. Serena could feel the tension building in the air around her, thick and heavy. The footsteps grew louder, and then Riley was at her window. She pressed the button, lowering it halfway. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of pine trees. Riley leaned down slightly, his face illuminated by the pale glow of her dashboard. His eyes were narrowed, filled with suspicion, and his jaw was set in a hard line. License and registration, he barked, his voice sharp. No pleasantries, just authority. His tone was demanding, almost as if he were trying to provoke her, to get a reaction out of her. Serena's gaze met his. Her expression was calm, neutral. She didn't flinch. She didn't break eye contact. She knew exactly what he wanted from her. He wanted her to be intimidated. He wanted to feel that moment of dominance. Slowly, deliberately, Serena reached for her glove compartment, retrieving the documents. Her fingers brushed against the edges of the registration and her ID. The cool paper somehow grounding her in the moment. She handed them to him without a word, her movements smooth and controlled. She wasn't giving him any more than he needed. Riley snatched them from her hand, his fingers brushing hers in what felt like an unnecessary show of dominance. He stepped back, his eyes scanning the documents. His frown deepened as he inspected them, his suspicion only growing. "This your car?" he asked, his voice hard, accusatory. Serena nodded, her tone even, calm. "Yes." But Riley wasn't satisfied with her answer. His eyes flicked past her, scanning the interior of the car with a look that could only be described as scrutinizing. He wasn't just questioning her car, he was searching for something to justify his instincts. He wanted her to slip up. He wanted to find an excuse to escalate. Then, his eyes locked on the black case resting on the passenger seat. Serena saw the moment his curiosity shifted to suspicion. The way his jaw tightened. The way his eyes narrowed. His body language shifted subtly. But she could see the storm brewing inside him. "What's in the case?" Riley demanded, his tone sharp, accusatory. He stepped closer, invading her space once more. Serena didn't flinch. Her mind raced, calculating her response. She had anticipated this moment. And she was ready. "Personal property," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "Nothing illegal." Riley's expression didn't change. He was still staring at the case, as if it held the answers to everything he had been questioning. Serena knew this was the tipping point. This was the moment where it could all spiral out of control. His hand hovered near his holster, his fingers twitching as though he were considering his next move. Serena could see it in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged. He wasn't used to being told no. He wanted her to comply. He wanted her to back down. But she didn't. I said step out of the vehicle. Riley barked, his voice rising slightly. The command was clear, forceful. There was no room for negotiation. He was trying to force her hand. Serena took a slow breath. She didn't need to resist. Not yet. But she wasn't going to make it easy for him either. She wasn't going to just comply and let him win. Is there a reason for this, officer? She asked, her tone still calm but laced with authority. She wasn't challenging him outright. She wasn't giving him the satisfaction of knowing how much power he had over her. Riley's grip tightened on his belt, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He wasn't getting what he wanted, and it was clear that it was eating at him. I said, step out of the vehicle, he repeated, his voice rising once more. He wasn't giving her an option. He was trying to force her into submission. Serena hesitated for a moment. She wasn't afraid. She knew that, but she also knew that pushing back might make things worse. If she stepped out, it might escalate the situation. But if she stayed calm, if she kept the upper hand, she could control how things unfolded. She nodded slowly, unbuckling her seatbelt. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. She opened the door, stepping out, her hands visible at all times. She wasn't giving him any reason to escalate. Riley gestured for her to move to the back of the car. Serena complied, her steps steady, measured, but as she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. Riley was no longer playing by the rules. He wasn't here to follow protocol. He was here to assert dominance. And Serena knew he wasn't about to stop. The cool night air pressed against Serena as she made her way toward the rear of her car. Riley's footsteps followed closely behind, his boots crunching against the gravel, the sound growing louder with each passing second. Serena's heart beat steadily, but her mind was a whirlwind of calculation. Every step she took, every breath she made, was a carefully measured move. She couldn't afford to show any sign of weakness. She knew what was at stake here. She reached the back of the car, placing her hands firmly on the trunk as Riley had ordered. His heavy presence loomed behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body even though he hadn't touched her. His breath was audible in the quiet night, his impatience palpable. Serena's mind wasn't on him, though. She was already 5 steps ahead, analyzing the situation, running through her options, and weighing the risks. She was well aware that Riley was hoping to provoke a reaction. He wanted to catch her off guard, to break her calm demeanor, and if she allowed it, he would use that slip to justify his aggression. But she had been trained for moments like this. There was nothing he could do to shake her. Turn around. Riley's voice barked from behind her. Serena didn't move immediately. She could hear him stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. But she didn't respond to the command. Instead, her gaze flicked to the darkened highway, the distant glow of headlights barely visible in the distance. Something was off. It wasn't Riley. It was the quiet, the way the night had gone deathly still. Serena's hand remained on the trunk of her car, her knuckles white from the grip. Her body was tense, but her outward demeanor remained calm. This wasn't the first time she'd been in this kind of standoff. And it wouldn't be the last. But this time felt different. The air was thicker. There was a sharpness to it, an edge that made her instincts scream. She shifted her weight slightly, subtly adjusting her stance. Riley hadn't noticed, too absorbed in his role as the enforcer of this seemingly petty stop. She could hear him shifting behind her, and she could feel the subtle tilt of his body as he tried to position himself to get a better view of her. He was already assuming that she would comply. But he was wrong. The seconds dragged on, stretching into what felt like eternity. It was a tense, taut silence, The kind that makes every muscle in your body ache with anticipation. Serena felt Riley's gaze boring into her back. Hot and sharp, but she refused to let it break her concentration. Then, the sound of distant engines. Serena's heart skipped a beat. Her senses suddenly heightened. She knew that sound, the deep growl of powerful engines, growing louder by the second, meant only one thing. Something was about to change. Riley didn't seem to hear it, too focused on his power play to notice the danger approaching. But Serena's trained ears caught every detail. The engines weren't coming from the direction of the highway. They were approaching from an entirely different angle, cutting through the stillness of the night with an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. Riley turned, likely trying to gauge the direction of the sound. But he was too slow. Serena had already seen what was coming. Within moments, headlights flooded the road, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of the engines roared louder, slicing through the tension like a hot knife through butter. The vehicles were closing in fast, and Serena could see the silhouettes of the approaching SUVs. Riley straightened, his eyes flicking from the headlights back to Serena, confusion flashing in his gaze. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, the edge in his voice sharpening with each second. But Serena didn't need to answer. She knew exactly what was happening. She had no doubt that Riley was out of his league now. The first SUV sped into view, followed closely by three more, their headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the narrow stretch of road. They formed a perfect semicircle around Serena's car, blocking off all possible escape routes. The sound of their engines hummed ominously in the night air, the power of the vehicles only adding to the tension that was slowly suffocating the space between them. The SUVs came to a sudden stop. The doors opened almost in unison, and Serena could hear the synchronized, deliberate movements of the agents inside. She didn't need to see them to know exactly who they were. She could feel their presence. These weren't just ordinary officers. These were highly trained individuals, part of a much bigger operation that Riley had no hope of understanding. Riley's hand instinctively hovered near his holster as his eyes darted between the approaching agents and Serena. The confusion on his face was evident. But there was something else beneath it, fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize you've made a mistake. And Riley was just beginning to realize that his arrogance had brought him to the edge of something far bigger than he could control. One of the agents stepped forward, his movements precise and calculated, a quiet confidence radiating from him. Serena didn't flinch as he approached. She kept her gaze locked with Riley's, unyielding, her expression as calm as ever. The agent's voice cut through the air, soft yet firm. "Step away from the vehicle," he said, his tone not asking but commanding. Riley didn't move immediately, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. "This is my jurisdiction," he said, his voice thick with bravado, though it wavered slightly at the edges. The agent didn't respond. Instead, he reached inside his jacket, pulling out a small, unmarked badge. He held it up for Riley to see, the emblem of the United States Secret Service gleaming under the harsh light of the SUVs. Riley's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, and Serena could see the realization hit him like a freight train. He had no idea what he was up against. The agent spoke again, this time with a calm authority that made it clear there was no room for argument. "Step away from the case. This is a federal operation." Riley's face twisted in confusion and anger. He wasn't ready to concede. Not yet. He had built his entire identity on control, on the power that came with his badge. To have it questioned in front of him was a humiliation he wasn't prepared to accept. He tried to stand his ground. "What the hell do you want with this case?" Riley demanded, his voice rising with frustration. The agent's expression remained unchanged, his tone as steady as ever. The case contains sensitive materials related to national security. Your interference has been noted. Officer Riley, stand down. But Riley wasn't ready to let go. His grip tightened around the case in his hand, and Serena could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. His pride, wounded by the arrival of these agents, pushed him forward. He wasn't about to back down. Not yet. The tension between them crackled in the air, sharp and electric. Serena's mind raced, but her gaze never wavered. The agents, now fully in position, were ready for whatever move Riley might make. But Serena wasn't concerned with Riley anymore. Her focus was on the agent who had spoken, the one with the badge. Agent Williams, the voice called out from behind her, and Serena felt a ripple of recognition. She turned slightly, her eyes narrowing. "I'm fine," she said, her voice carrying an edge of finality. But her words weren't aimed at the agent. They were for Riley. This officer, however, seems intent on making things complicated. Riley's face turned red with fury. "I'm not done with you yet," he spat, his eyes flashing with defiance. Serena held his gaze, her voice low but unwavering. "You should be," she said, the weight of her words sinking in. "This is bigger than you, Officer Riley, and you're about to find that out the hard way." The silence that followed was deafening. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the whole world was holding its breath, waiting to see who would make the next move. The agents stood in perfect formation, their movements fluid, synchronized, and efficient. They were a stark contrast to Riley, whose every gesture was erratic and filled with frustration. He was a man out of his depth, clinging to the remnants of his pride and control, neither willing nor able to admit that he had misjudged the situation entirely. Serena kept her eyes on him, her expression calm, yet her mind was anything but. She knew exactly what was coming next. The situation had escalated quickly, and it was clear that Riley wasn't going to back down. His arrogance had already pushed him too far. But she also knew that she couldn't let him drag this out any longer. She had a job to do. She couldn't afford to let his ego continue to cloud her focus. Riley shifted his stance, and Serena felt the change in the air immediately. The tension around them was almost palpable, thick and oppressive, as though every second was a countdown to something that could not be stopped. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on hers, his chest heaving with barely contained anger. "I'm not letting you walk away from this," Riley spat, his voice shaky but filled with an intensity that only fueled his need to dominate. "You can't just waltz in here and tell me what to do. I have every right to investigate." Serena didn't flinch. Her body was poised, ready for whatever move he might make. But she didn't need to act just yet. Riley was already making a critical mistake. He was so consumed by his need to assert control that he wasn't thinking clearly. He wasn't considering the consequences of his actions. One of the agents behind Serena shifted slightly, his posture a quiet signal that they were prepared for what was coming. Serena's hand subtly moved toward her sidearm, just in case things took a turn for the worse. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Riley's eyes flicked from the agents back to Serena, his frustration growing. He had no idea what he was dealing with, and the realization of that was eating him up inside. He wasn't used to being undermined. He wasn't used to not having control, and it was killing him. "Do you even know who I am?" Riley growled, his voice rising with a bitter edge. "This is my town, my jurisdiction. You are all trespassing." Serena took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes never left his, her presence commanding without being aggressive. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to show any outward signs of aggression. She simply exuded confidence. A confidence that made Riley's bravado look small and hollow in comparison. "You're right about one thing," she said, her voice steady but laced with an edge that cut through the tension. "This is your town. But this," she gestured to the agents, to the SUVs surrounding them, to the whole situation, "isn't your jurisdiction. And you're about to find out just how far out of your league you are." Riley's face flushed with a combination of anger and disbelief. He opened his mouth to retort. But before he could speak, a low hum of an engine cut through the air. A distant sound that seemed to grow louder by the second. It wasn't from one of the SUVs. Serena's eyes flicked to the horizon. Her instincts were telling her that something wasn't right. The unmistakable sound of more vehicles. No, not just vehicles, heavily modified ones. And they were closing in fast. Riley's expression shifted as he turned toward the road, his body tensing in an instant. The noise grew louder, a steady rumble of engines that cut through the stillness of the night. For a moment, there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It was as if his brain was racing to catch up with the situation, trying to piece together what was happening. But it was already too late. The first of the civilian trucks came into view, its headlights casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. The other two followed closely behind, their engines roaring, the ground vibrating beneath them. They didn't slow down as they approached. They didn't stop until they were directly in front of Serena's car and the SUVs that surrounded her. The trucks came to a screeching halt, kicking up dust and gravel in their wake. The men who stepped out of the trucks were not law enforcement. They didn't have the polished appearance of the Secret Service agents. Their clothes were dark, their faces hidden behind scarves and hats. There was something raw, something dangerous in the way they moved. These were not men you crossed lightly. Riley, still standing by Serena's car, froze. His eyes darted between the agents, who were already forming a defensive perimeter, and the men from the trucks. His grip on the case tightened, his fingers trembling with the realization that he had no idea who these people were, or what they wanted. The leader of the group of men stepped forward, his movements slow but deliberate, as if he were in control of the situation. He didn't look at Riley. His focus was entirely on Serena, his gaze cold and calculating. His presence exuded authority, a kind of silent power that made Riley's earlier bluster seem insignificant. "Evening," the man said, his voice low, laced with an almost casual menace. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little gathering out here." Serena didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on the man's. Unblinking, she didn't need to say anything. The situation was already crystal clear. These men were here for the case. They were here for something far more dangerous than anything Riley could have imagined. One of the agents behind Serena moved toward the front of the group, his posture shifting as he drew his weapon. The subtle shift in their movements was enough to alert the intruders that they were outmatched. But the leader didn't seem worried. In fact, his smile was almost amused as he sized up the situation. "We're not here to make trouble," the man said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But you're standing in our way. And that case you're so fond of? It's worth a lot to the right people. So, step aside." Riley's jaw clenched as he turned to Serena. His eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and rage. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Who are these people?" Serena didn't flinch. She didn't show any signs of fear. Instead, she stepped forward, her presence commanding and sure. "This is where you step aside, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Whatever you think you're doing here, it's over. We've got bigger problems to deal with. Riley opened his mouth to argue, to push back against the overwhelming sense of power that now surrounded him. But before he could say anything, one of the men stepped forward, his hand reaching into his jacket. Serena's hand twitched toward her holster, but she didn't draw. Not yet. She had to wait. She had to be sure. The man pulled out a tablet and held it up for Riley to see. His face remained unreadable, but the screen lit up, displaying a live feed of their entire encounter, from Riley's initial confrontation with Serena to the arrival of the civilian trucks. The footage was detailed, showing every movement, every word, and it was being broadcast to federal authorities as they spoke. Riley's eyes widened in shock as the full weight of the situation hit him. His grip on the case loosened, the reality of what was happening finally sinking in. He had no idea what he had just stepped into. Serena's voice cut through the moment of disbelief. "You've already done enough damage tonight. Officer, you've put lives at risk, including your own." The agents around her moved with precision, quickly securing the area, ensuring that Riley and the intruders were contained. Riley stood frozen in place, his mind a mess of confusion and regret. But the words that Serena had spoken echoed in his mind. "You'll learn that actions have consequences," Serena said, her voice steady and unwavering. "And tonight, you've just learned the hard way." Riley stood there, surrounded by men who could have crushed him with a single word. The humiliation was overwhelming, and as the sound of the engines roared back to life, he realized just how out of control he had been. And it was only just beginning. The heavy hum of the engines still echoed in the air as the convoy of SUVs, along with the civilian trucks, slowly began to disperse. The men in the trucks had surrendered without a fight, their hands raised as the agents moved in to secure them. They were quickly restrained, cuffed, and placed into the back of one of the SUVs. But Serena's attention never wavered from Riley. He was the one who needed to be dealt with now. Serena watched as Riley stood there, his chest heaving with anger and disbelief, the remnants of his control slipping away with every passing second. The humiliation was written all over his face. He had come into this situation believing he was the one in charge. But now, all of his bravado had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who was starting to realize just how far out of his depth he truly was. He was surrounded by men far more skilled, far more dangerous, and far more experienced than he could ever hope to be. And they weren't backing down. They were waiting for him to make a move. Serena stepped closer to him, her boots crunching softly against the gravel. The agents around her moved with practiced ease, securing the area, checking the perimeter, and ensuring that the civilians and the intruders would not pose any more threats. But Riley wasn't the focus anymore. He wasn't even a priority. Her eyes were locked on him as she approached. But she wasn't there to intimidate him. Not anymore. This was about closing the chapter. This was about ending it on her terms. Riley shifted his stance, his hands twitching at his sides, clearly unsure of what to do next. He was cornered, outnumbered, and he knew it. His lips pressed into a thin line. And for a moment, there was nothing but the cold night air between them. "You think you've won, don't you?" Riley spat, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were burning with rage. "You think just because you have a few badges behind you, you can control everything?" Serena's gaze didn't flicker. She was the picture of calm composure. A calmness that Riley couldn't seem to understand, couldn't seem to break. "I didn't win, officer," she said softly, her voice low but clear. "You lost the moment you let your ego take over. And you're not the only one who's paying for it." Riley's face twisted in frustration. "You don't understand," he said through gritted teeth. I was just doing my job. I didn't know what any of this was. I didn't know who you were. I didn't know any of this federal operation stuff. Serena stepped closer, her presence commanding as always. No, Riley, she said, her voice unwavering. You didn't know, because you never bothered to ask. You assumed you knew everything. And that assumption nearly got you killed. It nearly got others killed. Riley's chest tightened, and his eyes shifted away from hers for the first time. He looked at the ground, unable to meet her gaze any longer. He had no response, no defense. It's not about the badge, Serena continued. It's about what you do with it. You chose to use it to intimidate, to control, instead of protecting. And in doing so, you put everyone at risk. Riley swallowed hard, but the words felt like daggers, sinking deeper and deeper into him with every passing second. The harsh reality of what had happened was starting to sink in. And he couldn't escape it. Not this time. The sound of the SUV starting up again filled the silence. The agents were ready to leave, the operation winding down, but Serena knew this was the final moment. The final lesson. The one Riley wouldn't forget. You're lucky, Serena said, her tone almost pitying now. You still have your job. But you won't have the same confidence when you get back to the station. They'll see the footage. Your colleagues, your superiors, they'll all see it. The moment you thought you had everything under control. And the moment you realized just how wrong you were. Riley clenched his fists, his pride still fighting against the truth that was being laid bare before him. But deep down, he knew it was over. He couldn't argue anymore. He couldn't deny what he had seen with his own eyes. He had been outmatched. He had been outclassed. And he had failed. Serena paused, looking at him one last time. Her expression softened, just a little, but the edge of authority never left her eyes. Next time you see someone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs, she said quietly, her voice cutting through the tension. Remember this moment. Remember how wrong you were. Riley didn't say anything. He couldn't. The words stuck in his throat. And for the first time in a long while, he felt small, helpless, defeated. Serena turned her back on him, walking toward the lead SUV, where the agents were already preparing to leave. The convoy was ready to move out. And she had one last thing to take care of before the night was over. Riley stood there, frozen in place, watching as the vehicle started to pull away. He wasn't sure what he had expected. But this wasn't it. His mind raced with thoughts of how he would face the aftermath of this night. The footage would be reviewed. The questions would come. He would have to answer for his actions. And for the first time, Riley wasn't sure how he was going to justify what had happened. But the convoy was already disappearing into the distance, the sound of their engines fading as the night swallowed them whole. As Serena sat in the back of the lead SUV, she exhaled slowly, her mind still sharp, still focused. The mission wasn't over. There was still work to be done. But as she looked out the window, her gaze unwavering, she couldn't help but wonder if Riley would ever truly understand the lesson he had just learned. Or if he would continue to make the same mistakes. Either way, it wasn't her problem anymore. As we wrap up the story of Officer Riley and Agent Serena Jackson, let's take a moment to reflect on the lessons that have emerged from this intense and unforgettable encounter. It's easy to get caught up in the noise of our own lives. We all have our beliefs, our assumptions, our routines. But what happens when we're faced with something, or someone, that challenges those beliefs? What happens when we're forced to question the very things we thought we knew for sure? In the case of Riley, a man who believed his badge gave him the right to control and dominate, the lesson came hard. He learned the consequences of acting on assumptions, of assuming control without understanding the full picture. We all have our own versions of Riley, those moments when we let our ego take over. When we act without fully seeing the consequences of our actions. But here's the truth, the world doesn't owe us control. It doesn't owe us certainty. Serena, on the other hand, exemplified what it means to lead with calm confidence, to assess situations without rushing to judgment, and to act with purpose. Her approach to Riley wasn't about winning or showing superiority, it was about setting a higher standard. Not just for herself but for those around her. So, what can we take away from their encounter? The most important lesson is that assumptions can cloud our judgment. And sometimes we need to step back and see the bigger picture before we act. We can all benefit from taking a moment to pause, to reflect, and to challenge the ideas we hold so tightly. True strength isn't about control, it's about understanding, patience, and the ability to recognize when we're wrong. At the end of the day, life isn't about proving we're right or defending our ego. It's about learning, growing, and adapting. It's about being willing to admit when we don't have all the answers. And having the humility to step aside when we realize we're out of our depth. And finally, remember this, actions have consequences. Every decision we make, every word we say, every assumption we hold, it all has an impact on those around us. Sometimes, that impact is small, but other times, it's life-changing. So, take a deep breath, think carefully, and remember, how we act today shapes the world of tomorrow. Let's choose wisely, and let's choose with the understanding that we're all just a little bit more alike than we think.